You don't know what fear tastes like until you come home and realize someone has decided you don't own your life anymore. That's the flavor I woke up to standing on my own porch, a red seal notice flapping in the cold mountain wind, and Margaret Brinley, the HOA president, waving it in my face with a smile that said, "Comply or lose your home." No warning, no discussion, just seizure. 31 grand in fines. My sins: paint 2 green trees too tall, car in the driveway too long. My reward: locks changed, house repainted, auction date set. All while I was out of town for a week, 7 days away, and I come back to a life that doesn't belong to me anymore. I'd just finished 15 years as a federal appellate judge, spent a lifetime untangling the worst of humanity in a courtroom, and decided finally I wanted to be left alone. To my neighbors, I was Walter Prescott, retired engineer, quiet, nondescript, the guy who nodded good morning but never joined the HOA BBQs. I wanted solitude, a patch of pines, and the silence of Ridgerest Mountain Estates. Margaret must have thought I was the perfect mark. But there's always something folks like Margaret forget to check, like the original deed locked away in my safe, proving my house was built in '62, decades before the HOA even existed, plus a state heritage certificate making this place more museum than moneymaker. She missed that part. The drive home that night was quiet mountain road, bending through mist headlights, catching the frost in the trees. I was bone tired from DC, 7 days of stiff conference chairs and recycled air. I just wanted my chair, my view, a little whiskey, maybe the sound of the wind in the eaves. Instead, I saw my house stripped of its forest green, smothered in the same drab gray as every other place in this development. The air reeked of cheap latex paint, the kind contractors slap on fast and bill high. I stood at the door key, useless in my hand, a sticky smear of wet paint on my fingers, wondering who gave them the right. Boot prints in my flower bed, saw marks on the pine tree, my security camera gone, just a sad little bracket left behind. Everything had been handled recently, like they'd waited for me to leave before swooping in. That's when Margaret herself appeared, striding across the gravel in her power blazer, clutching her leather folder like a shield. "Mr. Prescott," she said with that syrupy practiced sympathy, "so sorry for the inconvenience, but we had no choice. Emergency procedures, you see." She read off violations: wrong paint, missing fees, the height of my trees, car parked over the limit totaling $31,000. I kept my face flat. People like Margaret, they expect you to shout, plead, or crumble. Instead, I nodded, took her paper, and walked away, heart pounding for a different reason than fear. I'd seen her type before. They thrive on thinking you're defenseless. But I'd spent a career reading people and reading patterns, and this wasn't just a mistake. This was a playbook. I settled into a small hotel, cracked open my safe, and started digging. 4 hours of county records, auction filings, transfer deeds, and cold coffee told the story. 23 homes snatched and auctioned in the last dozen years, each one violated for minor infractions, all sold at a discount to a single company, Summit Peak Properties, owned by Dennis Brinley, Margaret's brother. Most were flipped a year later for twice what they paid. The profit over $2 million. This wasn't about rules, it was about a pipeline. The HOA was their intake valve. I needed a witness, so I tracked down Harold Jennings, last year's casualty, now living in a cramped apartment that smelled like defeat. He'd lost his house while hospitalized after a stroke, fines racked up, auction date scheduled, home sold before he woke up. The final insult: buying back his wedding photo from a secondhand shop for $30. Harold showed me the paperwork, every notice sent to his empty house while he lay in a coma. No phone call, no emergency contact, just silence counted as consent. And when I left, he whispered, "There are others. They pick off the folks with no one to help." Margaret was running a system, not a community. She picked targets, isolated old sick away for business, and moved fast. My house, I realized, wasn't unique. It was leverage. I requested a list of all houses built before '87, all with preservation status. There were a handful, and I had what the others didn't: documentation and legal armor. The next letter arrived: structural emergency, auction date moved up, timeline halved. Panic and confusion were the weapons, and she wielded them with the confidence of someone who'd never lost. But she'd overlooked the fine print. My house predated the HOA, was explicitly excluded in the founding documents, and protected by state law. Every action they'd taken was a bluff with no teeth. But the fight wasn't just for me. It was for every Harold, every lonely neighbor who'd watched their life get snatched by bureaucracy. The development plans proved it. Margaret and Dennis had set up a $47 million resort right where our home stood. My address dead center in their blueprints. Their lawyer, Richard Thornton, wore two hats, one for the HOA, one for the development trust. Conflict of interest so thick you could trip over it. I gathered evidence called the State Preservation Office. Turns out painting my house without approval carried a $50,000 fine per incident. That gave me leverage, but I held it back. Margaret had to be caught in the act. The pressure rose. Anonymous text settlement offers Dennis Brinley sitting outside my hotel in his black truck watching. They thought surveillance was enough. But intimidation only works if you're afraid. I started gathering allies. My neighbor Arthur had security footage of the unauthorized work time stamped with Dennis on camera directing the job. I looped in the Denver Post, a reporter named Sarah Whitman who'd been chasing HOA horror stories for years. The day of the auction, I arrived early, documents in hand. Sarah in the wings with her camera. The room was packed. Residents, bidders. Margaret front and center in her navy blazer, sheriff by the wall. She tried to start the sale, but I stood and laid out the evidence piece by piece, my original deed, the exemption in the HOA's own rules, the preservation certificate, Arthur's footage records of every property they'd seized. The mood turned. Residents whispered, then shouted. Margaret tried to bluff. These claims will be reviewed and dismissed. The sheriff wasn't buying it. He paused the proceedings, called for an investigation. Margaret threatened me in a whisper. You think you've won? I've buried better men than you. But the confidence had cracked. Her lawyer backed away. Her brother looked for exits. No one stood up to defend her. Within a day, the story broke: news trucks, TV spots, interviews with Harold and other victims. Margaret tried to spin it, protecting property values, following rules, but her mask slipped on camera. These people are problems, she said. That clip went viral. The Attorney General opened an investigation. The IRS followed the money. Margaret's political connections tried to save her, but public attention made them cowards. Board members started flipping. One, Gerald Patterson, handed me emails showing Margaret and Richard ranked homeowners by resistance potential, targeting those most alone or ill. They called them acquisition candidates. The HOA scheduled an emergency meeting trying to salvage order. The hall was packed to the rafters. Margaret, still fighting, tried to rally the crowd. We did what we had to do. Residents finally found their voices. Harold stood, voice shaking but clear, and told his story. Margaret snapped, "You people have no idea what it takes." And then the words that ended her, "I did what had to be done and I'd do it again." Silence. Then the sheriff stepped in and Margaret and Dennis were led away, the room watching, nobody moving to help. 6 months later, I sat in court as the verdict came down: guilty on all counts. Fraud, tax evasion, violations of state law. 12 years in federal prison for Margaret, 8 for Dennis. Restitution for every stolen home. The HOA dissolved, new state law in the works to keep this from happening again. Harold got his house back. 7 families returned home. Me, I went back up the mountain, hung the old house number carved in 62, back on its hook, poured myself a whiskey, and watched the sun set. My house green and quiet, and finally safe. And here's what you need to know. Justice is slow, but sometimes it comes, and when it does, it's because someone knows their rights and refuses to back down. Margaret thought power was everything. But power without accountability is just a lie waiting to be exposed. Now let me ask, where's the line between protecting a community and feeding on its weakest members? How many rules does it take before they become a weapon? And what would you do if you were next? Share your thoughts, your stories. Have you ever fought back against an injustice? Let's talk about justice, power, and what it means to stand up when no one else will. If you want more real stories like this, subscribe, comment, and remember, your deed might just be your strongest weapon.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.